The first piece for a new leader, when I think about like there being a process, is to meet with everyone on their team, meet with key stakeholders, really learn about what's going well and what could be improved. Where are the pain points? To get a sense of that. So the beginning is truly gathering information, listening, and connecting. And that way you have a foundation also of folks understanding that you care. Because when I think about the difference between a manager who is good and one who isn't, the biggest difference is that you have to care.
Welcome to the Nice Business Podcast. I'm your host, Richard Train, executive coach, leadership and culture consultant, and I'm joined by my good friend, Jim Bob Howard, veteran technical consultant. Together, we have more than 60 years combined of business and organizational experience. The purpose of this podcast is to have short but meaningful discussions about the people and culture side of business and how owners and executives can be both kind and successful. Hi, welcome back to another episode of the Nice Business Podcast. I'm Richard Train, your host, with my co-host, Jim Bob Howard, and our good friend, Jennie Loev, who is an executive coach. And today we're going to have a conversation about something that we're all very excited about. Before I get to the topic, I want to say that this episode is brought to you by the Answer Me Customer Service Leadership System. Upcoming seminars coming up soon. Now, Jennie, we're going to be talking about something that is a topic that we talked about that you actually brought up to us, and I love, and it is called promoted and unprepared. Now, yes. I love to get into this topic of conversation, and I know that all of us have had the experience of dealing with companies that have promoted people either too soon or people who were in different situations where they were really great at the work, but they were promoted into management level positions and weren't really prepared for that. So I would love to get into this topic a little bit. Tell us a little bit, first of all, before we get into the topic, remind everybody who's listening about you and where you come from and how we all know each other.
Thank you. About me and where I come from, I am a triple Longhorn, meaning I went to UT undergrad, UT grad school, and then I worked at UT. But I know you both from my first time at UT as an undergrad. And so I had the pleasure of meeting each one of you there. So I'll start with that and share that since then, my career has been rather nonlinear. And I was a psychology major. And then I went into business and I got my MBA. And I came to discover that coaching is basically the marriage of psychology and business. And I get to support and help people. But in terms of leaders, I coach leaders who genuinely care about the kind of leader they are and want real support. And I love coaching them at companies that really care about their people and their team members too. And I feel very honored and grateful that I get to do that. And I also feel very honored and grateful that I get to come back to be on this podcast with you both. So thank you very much.
Well, we're thrilled to have you.
Great to have you.
So let me just throw this out now about the topic. Let me just ask you the first question then. Why do great employees struggle when they become managers?
You know, oftentimes people think of it as like the next step. It's a reward. It's what you're supposed to do. But the skills that it takes to be an outstanding individual contributor are very different from leading and managing people. And I think a lot of folks struggle because, first of all, if they were an outstanding individual contributor and a rising star, or however they were tagged, high potential at their companies, they get this idea of, I can do everything, and everybody thinks they can do everything. So nobody gives them the tools to figure out how to transition into something that's very people-oriented. It's not about them achieving the results, but about motivating, supporting, empowering their team members to achieve results, and also dealing with the interpersonal challenges of it. At the same time, let's say you're a great individual contributor. You put your head down, you do the work. In this situation, you need to make sure you're like a new leader, or a leader needs to make sure they're having the tough conversations. They're not waiting.
I'll tell you, just from the standpoint of an employer, that I've been on the management teams where you know that there's going to be a vacancy at a managerial level. And you're thinking, do we go outside and find somebody else to come in? It's hard for them to be able to find somebody else. So you think, well, you know, Jenny's so great, it would be obvious that she should take the next managerial role and promote from within.
Well, I think that's a question to ask too, is if you're looking to promote from within, who do you choose, right? Especially if you are one of those star individual contributors who is kind of maybe hit a ceiling, but is everybody loves, they're kind of the linchpin of the organization. How do you promote them, or do you promote them? How do you decide? Right? Because my thought is that just because someone is a great individual contributor doesn't mean they necessarily want to be management. Maybe they think they want to be in management, but they don't really understand. They think, oh, cool, it's, I'm doing well in this role. I could lead the team and get paid more or have more responsibility. But really even understanding what that looks like to move to that next level when you haven't been a people person, you haven't been responsible for delegating anything or for hiring or for firing or having the tough conversations. Maybe they're great with a client, but maybe they're not so great with their teammates when it comes to having hard conversations. How do you even determine how you're going to bring someone up to that management position, get them prepped for that management position, and then make sure they have the support once they're there?
I'll add to that. I think I've been thinking about the phrases that get used in organizations, drinking from a fire hose, like sink or swim. And so I think so often that person, especially who's already proven themselves, they just get thrown in. And if they can figure it out, great. And if they can't, then they're fired. And I think what you're talking about, Jim Bob, and what I think is so important is making sure that you really spend time talking to the folks on the existing teams, like finding out, is this something that you would want to do? And let's talk about what it really means. Being very clear on the expectations, because it's also, you mentioned like people just getting excited about being hired, but some people also feel pressure. They're in a leadership role, and now there's a larger one available, and they don't feel like they can even say no. So you've got like these different layers, but I think that looking at it as this is a new job versus more of the same, like you go from being an assistant to a senior assistant on something, is very different from going to like a manager to a senior manager or senior leader. And being really clear on what that is, which I think a lot of organizations don't invest the time. And I think that the leaders who bring them in also aren't taking the time to really check in and coach them. My first job that I was leading people, and eventually I got to go to a new manager training, and I did reach out for extra access to the instructor because I wanted the support. But I don't remember my boss ever saying, hey, let's talk about like how you're leading and what your process is, and let's see where I can help and support you. There was no attention to that at all.
Yeah. Don't you think it's also a factor within the business itself? Because it depends on the kind of business that it is and what that culture is. I mean, I can remember working for companies where, the company that I had my first management experience with didn't really have a management training program in any way, shape, or form. And it wound up being that it was a sink or swim kind of moment. Here you are, you're now running this department and you need to figure it out. And yes, if I had known the questions to ask my senior management people, I could have asked them, but there was no structure in place. And I think we've all been in organizations where they do have structures in place where they help to develop their managers. So let's talk a bit about, where do you see effective structures for businesses? How do they go about doing things that will help develop people, whether it's a big company or a small company?
So what I've seen in my clients and organizations that do it well is a lot of intention and a lot of clarity and transparency. So because there's the person, but it's also the team that's affected. And when you're left not knowing what's happening or understanding the reasoning, or it makes folks anxious, and you as a company are basically enabling them to not do their work because they're going to invest so much time in worrying. And that doesn't make sense. But the companies that do it well really take the time to think about what the new leader needs to know. They set clear priorities and goals with them. It's not just on the leader, because that's the challenge too. And they also will bring in a coach like me or like you to support their team members in making the changes. And the beautiful thing in bringing in someone external is this does not in any way impact how they're perceived within the company. They're not trying to get help from somebody that might judge them in any capacity. It's from folks who can support them beyond it. But it is setting those clear expectations, which include also the communication with, like, how are you planning to have team meetings? How often are you going to have one-on-ones? Like, even just that. It's not just here's your corporate goals, but what are the plans to make sure that the team is brought in a way that feels authentic, genuine, and moves things forward?
The interesting thing is I've seen when companies that are small are thinking about promoting from within. And I was actually having a conversation with somebody about this about a month ago. And he was thinking about hiring some people or promoting from within. And he said, I'm not really sure whether this is going to be a good idea or not. And I said, what kind of leadership roles are you giving this person now? And he said, I'm not really sure. They always step up and help take the lead in the projects that they are working on within their team. Okay, that's great. But are you giving them leadership tasks on a project to delegate that to them to see how they do just within the team, just on a single project or something? Not necessarily being a whole team lead or anything like that, but just on this particular one little thing. And then start to dole out those little leadership moments to start exercising those muscles. And he said, no, I'm going to have to look into that. And we still haven't caught up yet, but I'd love to hear how that works. Now, that's great for a small business that doesn't really have that structure like we were talking about.
Yeah, no, I think that's fantastic. And I'll add to that, some companies will make sure or will encourage their folks and even put it as part of their objectives to take on a leadership role of an organization outside of the company. So for instance, It could be an industry organization or it could be a volunteer organization, but something that gives them that opportunity to demonstrate leadership and learn in an environment that is separate, but that also just allows them to work on those skills.
Yeah. Be on the board of their local community center or their church or something like that. Yeah, there are lots of leadership opportunities.
The thing that keeps coming to my mind is for the person who aspires to be a new leader or maybe being tagged to step up to a new leadership role and doesn't really necessarily know what that's really going to look like. Can you kind of walk us through, like as a new manager or as a new leader, what should the focus be on even just getting yourself up to speed? It's great if the company's got a leadership plan, but let's say they don't. How would you advise a new leader being able to step up to that role?
So my recommendation would be that they first of all start by gathering information, because I think it's very natural that when you promoted in any capacity, you want to prove yourself as fast as possible. You want to show everyone why you were the one who was picked for this. And the problem with that is that then instead of listening, taking in, understanding the current context, you jump in and basically are like a bull in a china shop, making a mess and not making friends. And so the first piece for a new leader, when I think about like there being a process, is to meet with everyone on their team, meet with key stakeholders, really learn about what's going well and what could be improved. Where are the pain points, to get a sense of that. So the beginning is truly gathering information, listening, and connecting. And that way you have a foundation also of folks understanding that you care. Because when I think about the difference between a manager who is good and one who isn't, the biggest difference is that you have to care. A lot of managers kind of phone it in and they're like, this is just what I do and whatever, but like they do not care about their people. And if you don't care about your people beyond just like, are they achieving their goals? Are they motivated? Are they whatever? Then people will know that, and they will know that there's not that genuine authenticity. So part one would be really taking everything in. And then from there, also learning about the corporate priorities, whatever those may be, and starting to develop ideas for adjustments, but then testing those, not making a dramatic change, but testing it with folks, meaning just talking, saying, hey, I've been thinking about this thing. Have y'all ever tried this? What did you think? Because the other thing a new manager will come in and do is be like, we need to do this. And then the team is like, we've done that 5 times. And so as a result, they're not making their team members aren't going to trust them, because they're just kind of going and doing their own thing versus, and it doesn't mean it needs to be a whole bottom up situation, because I've seen that unravel in like terrible ways where the leader was so open to whatever the team wanted, and that did not help them as a leader, and it also didn't help the end result of what they were working on be good, if I'm going to be blunt. So I think too, it's about starting to identify, but then testing and finding out. And it doesn't mean that they also can't say, I know we've tried this 5 times before, but I'd like to try it again. And I want to try it in this way, and we'll see. So there's also like coming in with humility. I would say that's like, regardless of the steps that you take, that humility, not acting like you already know everything, makes a huge difference. Because again, what you really want in the beginning is to develop those relationships, develop trust. And at the same time, then that moves us sort of more into communication and being really intentional with communication. Because one of the things that gets in the way of most every manager is they don't address things, and they don't want to address them, and they wait for them to work themselves out. And then they become something that becomes a very messy, difficult situation where potentially, I'm thinking of so many examples right now, but where potentially, people on the team are very angry, hurt, frustrated, whatnot, or somebody's not doing their work well. And everybody's looking at them saying, we are working really hard, and they aren't. And so there's so many different situations where not having a hard conversation makes it so that then the leader is basically also, they're minimizing, they're going to be discounted by their team, because their team is going to be like, they let this person get away with this, or they let this thing go on that should have been addressed. And so I think like I come back to Brene Brown saying, clear is kind.
Yeah, that's right.
You've got to give that clarity and transparency. But I think the more also a new manager can come in with some sort of structure in terms of their own expectations, not only for themselves, but also for their team members. So that it's not, I think like there's a leader I've worked with who it took a while to help him transition from assuming that his team knew what he wanted and what they needed to do, to being clear about his expectations of that and what it looked like specifically. And so it's kind of like if I said to you, you need to act like a professional. Okay, that means different things to different people. I have a client who's got an overseas team member, and that team member, what they might think is professional in their culture, how they might approach things could be entirely different than what we do here in the US.
Yeah. Gosh, so much going through my mind here with this topic, Jennie.
I know, that's what I keep talking.
I know, all great points. And I think that we're all sitting there going back and thinking about people that we've known in our past. I mean, in the different jobs that we've had, different organizations and everything. I can tell you from both public sector and private sector, people who were raised up to the next level before their time, even if there was a good, solid process in place. I think the onus is not just on the manager to better prepare themselves and to learn how to ask better questions and how to then move from being peer to supervisor, but also the onus is on the organization, that the managers who are going to promote that person, to make sure that they're giving the right, doing their due diligence first. So let's focus on that side of it first. Okay, let's talk about what the company should do before promoting someone. So what are your thoughts on that?
So my first thought is those conversations that I mentioned, making sure that people understand what leadership is and what it isn't in terms of the organization, and that next move is a key piece so that there's clarity around it. And also identifying this isn't a reward. This is a new job, and being very clear about it. And then at the same time, identifying here are the things that right now, and here's what you need to know, and starting them to learn that. Like we talked about, they could take on leadership opportunities. You mentioned, Richard, at, within the company or external to the company, but where they start to have exposure to that. But I think having some structure around here are the leadership priorities. Here's what we expect from you. And then here's also how we're going to support you to get there. Because like I said, when somebody's been a star, they're just thrown in to sink or swim, drinking from a fire hose, and either they do or they don't, which is completely, if you think about it from just a financial ROI perspective, you spend can't think of the precise number, but of the first year of somebody's salary, I feel like it's like 80% is basically onboarding.
Yeah.
And so if you consider that, and then now you've got somebody who's not only been onboarded, but they've gone through all this time and experience, then you put them in a role that they're not equipped to do. You don't give them support around it. You expect them to just figure it out. It not only affects them, it affects their team. It can affect the customers. It can tank them where they're put in a role that they aren't prepared for, and nobody seemed to be ensuring that they are. I think having that added support, which I think is an adjustment too, if you think about like somebody who's doing amazing in their role,
Right.
and they probably don't need a lot of one-on-one, like as many one-on-one meetings. They don't need a lot of hand-holding. But now I think it's important for the organization to take a step back and say, what do they need? Now, ideally, they also offer training or submit them to programs or bring in a coach to help them ensure that they're moving forward to achieve, ensure's putting it the right word, but help them move forward to achieve their goals. I think there's a huge onus on the company, because I feel like a lot of those metrics of measuring a new leader and whatnot are set to the side and not prioritized. And I think, and it truly costs the company so much money. And like, if you have an unhappy team, I know somebody who had 300% turnover on their team.
Oh my goodness.
So if the team is not happy, then you were constantly having to bring new people on. And if the manager, who was a rock star before, is now set up to fail and they're used to succeeding, then it's demoralizing. How long are they going to stay in a situation where they are feeling inferior?
Where they're no longer the rock star.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Jennie, we were talking at one point about, I think you call them your 4 archetypes of managers, and when they get into a role that they're just not really prepared for whatever reason. Can you go through those? How does someone identify, like, maybe they think they're doing okay, but here's some things to look for in what you're doing that may say, you know what, I probably need some support. Maybe it's time to ask for some leadership support, some training, something along those lines.
That is a great question. I'm glad you brought that up, because I think it is really important for folks to be able to be introspective about it. And usually by the time they get to me, they have done some introspective work. I have a new client who said she spent a year thinking about this. And so she was like, I spent a year. So the 4 archetypes are, do them one at a time, but the doer, that's the person who basically just takes on all the work, and they keep doing what they did before. And then their team members ask them a question and they do more. And their team members ask them like how to do something, and they have an immediate answer. So they're doing nothing to develop the team. And they're also taking everything on themselves. There was a Harvard Business Review article many years ago about the monkeys on your back. And so this is the person who's taking all the monkeys. Anytime somebody tries to put a monkey on them, they take it on, and they are getting buried in being overwhelmed. And those are the ones who burn out. So then we have the second one is the micromanager. That's the person who, and what happens is when you're in this new role, you want to impress, you want to show people you're where you're supposed to be. And oftentimes, by making sure everybody's doing what they're supposed to be doing, every little thing that they're doing, nothing is happening without your input as a micromanager. It helps you deal with the fear.
Yeah.
But at the same time, you're showing folks that you don't trust them.
Yeah.
And so you're completely shooting yourself in the foot, and very few people prefer micromanagers. Some do,
I feel like those two may be like two sides of a similar coin, right? Because if you're the doer, you've been doing it. And so now that you're in the leadership role, you just do more. Whereas if you're the micromanager, it's because you've been doing it really well and you got promoted to leadership. So your way must be the right way. So you're walking through people doing it your way, right?
Well, and I would say that I think with each of these, there's interwoven elements.
Sure.
And certain archetypes can show up at certain times and others can show up at different times, at different times. But I think like the doer is taking it all on, and the micromanager is letting others do it, but not leaving them alone to do it. And so but they're very similar and very similar motivations or backgrounds. Then we have the avoider, and that's the person who just wants everything to figure its way out. And so they don't have the tough conversations. They don't let somebody know that they're underperforming. They don't handle any interpersonal conflict. I did a post, sharing that we were going to be doing this podcast recording, and someone mentioned No one talks about managers becoming therapists. And it's not, I don't want to say that managers become therapists, but they do have to respond to, support interpersonal situations that would have never come up before. They
Right.
know about their team members' personal lives at times if they're going through something, because the person is trying to tell them why they maybe aren't at their best. But so the avoider is the person who's just like, I don't want it, like I kind of debated as I've thought about the archetypes, if there should be like the person who just wants to be liked.
Yeah.
But I feel like almost all of these, except for the micromanager, can come down to like, I just want to be liked. The avoider doesn't want to have a hard conversation because they don't want anybody to be mad at them. And
Right.
they're conflict avoidant. And the fourth is the imposter, which I would say that most every leader, and especially a new a position leader, whether it's their first leadership role or it's a new leadership role, experiences the times of being the imposter, which is what we talked about last time, imposter syndrome. But they basically go from being the expert on everything to a beginner manager when they're brand new. And they feel like a fraud and they don't know what they're doing. And I mean, I've coached folks who are really senior and incredibly impressive. And they're like, Jennie, I don't know what I'm doing. And I'm like, you do, you do. But the problem is what they're not getting from their workplace and from their leader is support around here, like we talked about before, here are the expectations so that they know here are the things that are important to us for you to do as a leader. And so they're just thrown in and then they're like, I don't know what I'm doing. I mean, my first time as a manager, within 2 months, one of my team members who was older than I said, you're the best boss I've ever had. And I was like, how's that possible? I have no idea what I'm doing. But like, I do think that for each of these, when you consider the person who does all the work, the person who doesn't let anybody do anything without them knowing exactly what's going on and having a hand in it, the person who is avoiding having a conversation, and then the person who's just so uncomfortable that everything they're going to do is going to be framed in the like, I'm afraid to do anything because I don't want to look like an idiot and I want to look like I'm smart and I'm capable. And of course they promoted me to this role because I know everything about everything. And as a result, they're very likely to not ask for help, to not ask questions, to not be curious, because that's showing a vulnerability of, I don't know everything.
Yeah, and great archetypes. And there are a couple of others that I wrote up a whole archetype list of things in a training that I did 100 years ago. And another one that I was talking, I actually had one called the monkey thrower, talking about somebody who accepts all the monkeys on your back. And I think we've all worked with people who will do everything that they can do to get other people to do their work for them. And the monkey thrower is an expert at that. That's like a woman that I worked with. And she would seem dumb, but she was really intelligent. And she would just give off this dumb vibe. And I'm like, that's not you. But she would say, I don't know what I'm doing. Can you go over with me again how you wanted me to do that thing? And it was when I was a young manager, and I would start doing it in front of her to show her what she needed to do. And at one point, end of the day, I had that V8 head smack moment. It's like, I can't believe I was doing all of her work for her. Right. She got me to do that. And there was an old salesman in me. They're like, good for her. And then,
right.
And then another part of it, I was like, damn it. And so I realized what was going on. So she was like the picture in my head when I did that training years later about that archetype, the monkey thrower. But back to your other archetypes, I don't know if you feel that this is true, but I've also noticed somebody who is a very specific type of micromanager. The opposite of that is the imposter syndrome. I think that this other leader that I worked under, who was really intelligent and really qualified at her job, was a horrible micromanager. I reported directly to her along with a lot of other senior managers, and she would make everybody rework a lot of stuff because she was just not clear on whether the numbers that we were coming up with or the reports that we were giving her, if she was comfortable presenting that to her superiors, because it didn't make her look perfect. And so she felt like she was an imposter. So she would make everybody go back even beyond deadlines and do that. And it really made everybody really upset. So I know I'm using
I
a lot
do
of
think
reallys in that, but that was the case and everybody was feeling it.
Yeah.
I do think that that traditionally is more common with women, that level of micromanagement, because we haven't been cultivated since childhood as like being perfectly good enough is good enough.
Right.
We really think the only way we deserve to be in the room is if we're perfect. And so I think so it's interesting that was a woman, because I've definitely seen, and it's not that men can't be similar because they have their own, everybody has their own struggles, but I do think it's probably from a percentage of women perspective versus percentage of men, I would guess that it's more skews more women.
Interesting. Interesting.
This reminds me of the conversation we had with Art Markman after we met with you, Jenny, that
Mm-hmm.
you sent to us. And one of the things that he brought up, which has just really kind of stuck with me, is that most of the time, and I feel like most managers who get promoted before they're really prepared for it, kind of fall into this, and we probably all do in whatever our role is. It's that, but we put so much focus on mistake minimization, like we're trying to avoid mistakes,
Mm-hmm.
when really what we need to do is focus on mistake recovery, because mistakes happen, right? And so when we come into something, when we're learning something new, like we didn't go from crawling to walking, right? We crawled, we stood, we tried to walk, we fell, we got up again. Like you learn from the mistakes
Mhm.
to do it better, but we work so hard on minimizing the mistakes that we don't actually get the opportunity to learn something and actually learn how to recover from those mistakes.
Yeah.
And I feel like that's where the imposter feels like, am I supposed to know how to recover from these yet? No, you're brand new in the job, right? And so I don't know, maybe speak to that a little bit.
Yeah.
I mean, I think what you're bringing up is safety, psychological safety in the workplace,
Right.
which is so huge and
Yeah.
so under explored, I would say, and
Mm.
not prioritized enough by companies. Because ultimately, if your culture is one where people cannot fail, or they're going to be judged, critiqued, they're not going to be given the coaching, the opportunity to grow and develop
Yeah.
from that, then you are going to reduce the amount of risk that folks take, which means that in terms of innovation, completely tanks innovation. Everybody's
Yeah.
afraid to make a suggestion or a change. And that is really important. And again, when I worked at UT, I would talk about I wanted a happy team. And what that meant was I want everybody to be happy. I also wanted them to be really productive, but I wanted them to be happy. And I also didn't want them wasting time worrying about anything organizational or whatever. Like I was like, y'all have jobs to do. Enjoy them, be nice to each other, have fun. And at the same time, if anything comes up that you are concerned about, that you've heard a rumor about or whatever, y'all don't spend a bunch of time discussing it, bring it to me. And I will share as
Mm-hmm.
much as I can, because I feel like without psychological safety, there's so much anxiety in the body.
Yeah.
There's so much that's truly worthless if you consider, like, if the goal is for them to be productive employees, and let's just take out their personal happiness or satisfaction. But if the goal is productivity, by not being transparent, by creating an environment where folks feel like they don't, I remember asking somebody, I was like, I really just want you to try to be strategic. That's what we're going to work on in this period, is like
Mm-hmm.
strategic approach to things. And I was like, and if it doesn't, like, if it doesn't go that way, that's okay. I just want you to try. And
Yeah.
it didn't work. It was too much. That's not how she thinks. And that's okay. But she tried it. We did it. No negative energy around it, even though I
Yeah.
asked her to do something that I knew was a massive stretch. And so
Yeah.
when you're a new leader, or supporting a new leader, really creating that space for that person to say, what am I doing here? I think is
Mm-hmm.
really, really key. And that's where also I think the peer groups, like Richard, what you do, I think is really important. Creating spaces that also are outside of an organization that allow for
Mm-hmm.
folks to speak freely. But if you're in a role where you're going to be penalized for taking a chance, making a mistake, making a typo, and the response is going to be punitive, even if that's just in words,
Yeah.
what you're creating are folks who are going to minimize themselves and minimize they're going to be shrinking what they're doing and the impact of what they're doing so that they don't trigger that response.
Yeah, one of the things, and that's so hard as a manager, and one of the things that I had to learn when I was a new manager is to eventually get to the point where I was like you, Jenny. I wanted everybody to like each other. And the whole thing of we're one big family, I soon learned that there are a lot of very dysfunctional families out there. And so just saying that we're like a family isn't necessarily the thing to aspire to, because like what you were saying, Jenny, is that if the goal is productivity as opposed to everybody getting along and loving each other, I eventually got to the point where I don't necessarily have to care if you like each other or if you don't. But what I do care about is you have to be professional, you have to be collegial, and you have to have your eye on what are our goals. To use an overused term, what is our why? And what is it that we're trying to do? So I guess my question out of all that is a new manager has to learn how to have these hard conversations with people when they are not behaving in ways that are collegial and professional and focused on the goal. So I know what I've said to people, but I would love to hear from you. Like, how have you coached somebody in how to start having those hard conversations as a new manager?
I think it's such a good point because it is central. And truly, ultimately, I just wanted them to show each other civility and respect. Like, I did a whole training. I created a whole thing on civility and respect in the workplace. I'm like, you have to be kind, and the rest of it doesn't matter, especially as the team grew. Then dynamics change and whatnot. But in terms of helping somebody start to have those tough conversations, first, it's about looking at what happens, what's the outcome, what's the negative outcome if you don't. How does that impact not only what's the repercussion? How does that impact not only the person you want to talk to, but other people within the group? And then it's about identifying how can they authentically have this conversation? How can they approach it in a way that feels very genuine to them? Because I think what tends to happen is folks want to get a script and then they want to try to follow the script, and then it's so awkward that it does nothing. And so, but I think they have to really understand the why, bringing it back to the why of the conversation, why it matters, why it's important, what's going to happen if it doesn't get addressed, and what are some of the potential outcomes. And then identifying a way to go about it and giving them space to practice it, to make sure that they are addressing it in a way that, and that's where, like, it's as a coach, there's that space and time to like review it and say, okay, how are you planning to approach it? And then they can feel the words, which is very different from thinking them.
Yeah. I want to ask you both, since you're both in the coaching space and I'm not. What are some things, like if I were a business owner and I recognize that maybe there's some gaps in my preparing new managers, but I don't really know what they are, where would I start? What could I do tomorrow to move towards understanding maybe where the gaps are?
Jenny, I'd suggest you go first on this one.
Okay. So how do we move forward? How do you move forward, or how do you get started when you're thinking about how to create that structure around the organization? I think it starts with creating some structure so that there's clarity on, like, you want to figure out what the gaps are, but first you need to understand, like, what are the priorities? And so focusing on what is important to the organization, what is important for this person to do. And one of the exercises I've done with some folks before is had them rate where they feel like they are right now on them, so that when you think about gaps. Now, the interesting thing is when I went back with one person and said, okay, like, I had them updated a year later, and they were like, yeah, I just didn't know what I didn't know. They definitely had elevated, but they gave them that opportunity to reflect and recognize it. And so I think the first step to take is to be clear about what are the expectations, what needs to happen. And that includes both the relational piece as well as the structure of things like team meetings and one-on-ones. I keep coming back to them because I think those are the kinds of things that easily get dropped when people get busy, especially when leaders get busy. And I think that they are so important in the beginning. The team meetings, I'll say, I think are always important. It depends on how you organize them. But I do believe a very structured team meeting is important, so that you're really intentional with how the time is spent. because we spend so much time in meetings. And I think that feeling like, oh, here's just another one isn't going to make everybody excited to be on the team. But I think, so I would say that's the first step, would be really to get very clear on the expectations, what that looks like, to potentially work with someone or leverage ChatGPT for a little bit of additional, to do some brainstorming and just start thinking about like what is most important for us, but also knowing like what's the real culture we want to have here, not the one we just want to say we have. So
all great points. And I would add to that, ultimately it comes down to looking back at where were the instances where we had promoted within where it worked and where it didn't, and start to define why it worked. Was it strictly the personality of that person that was promoted? Okay, what did he or she do that was effective? And start to really define those points to figure out where did it work well and why, and then go to the ones that didn't work well, so because you're learning from that too, because we don't want to repeat the same mistakes again. You want to repeat the ones that worked well. So first of all, go back, study what you did and where it worked and where it didn't work. That's number one. Then number two, start repeating and improving and iterating on the things that worked well, and start coming up with a structure, like Jennie says, on those things that work well, so you can make it more of a structural thing that any other manager can implement within their part of the organization. So they can start defining, who are my natural leaders and why are they leading? And then we can start doling out little leadership opportunities for each of them to start building a bench. And that's what I would recommend.
Building the bench is so critical. That I feel like that does not get enough attention. And it amazes me. Somebody could say they're retiring in a year and nobody's thinking about it until it's like 3 months before. And
and then
you have another one of those holy crap moments.
Yeah.
Oh yeah. Mm-hmm. And then you had to put the gap, and then you have somebody onboarding where it's like we needed them to start 6 months ago, but now they just got to catch up and go.
Yeah.
But yeah.
One last thing I do want to delve into that we really haven't touched on yet, though, is there are so many facets of this whole conversation that we could get into.
Yeah.
But Jim Bob, you remember we had a conversation with somebody earlier in the series where he was talking about the managers who started off doing the work and then they moved up to management and they couldn't pull themselves off the line of doing the work. They couldn't be the manager, that next step. So how do you help somebody who still wants to be involved in that work to feel like they're close to it, as opposed to leading the others?
I would add to that oftentimes organizations don't support them offloading any work. Them delegating. So the first step is for an organization to recognize that if this person is leading other people and managing other people, that they need to be clear on how the percentage of individual contributor responsibilities they have. Because I just think that most organizations just add in the management and then expect the person to figure it out, but they also expect them to keep producing like they have been. But I do think that for that person, sometimes they need that additional conversation and support around, this is your job. Like your job is to lead and manage these people, and getting them also thinking about the percentage. How are you spending your time? Like what percentage of time are you spending leading and managing versus doing the work? And how is that impacting you as a manager? So I think it's a little bit of it's digging deeper into like, what are you doing and why? And so helping them get that awareness. But the organization has to support them adjusting and delegating, because I do think that a lot of organizations just don't. And if the organization cares about their people and they want this person to be successful, then they can set them up for success by coaching them on it and making sure that, again, it's really clear, this is what we want from you. Because it's also hard too, like when you're used to like seeing specific quantitative results to you, and now you're going to release them. Again, you have to get back to that psychological safety. If you don't have that safety there, how can you let it go? Because you're fearful that like, if that number doesn't stay where it's been. So it's really, the onus is on the organization and that person's manager to ensure that they understand we know you're transitioning into a new role as a manager and a leader, even though you are leading your peers, which is a whole other conversation we could have, because going from being a peer and then leading your peers is its own struggle. But making sure that, again, that there's that clarity of here's the expectation. And let's say that the company maybe isn't as organized around it, creating the space to say to the new leader, I want you to think about what makes sense and what you think would make sure that your team is the most successful team it can be, and have them start thinking about it from that perspective. If the organization hasn't, because sometimes too, you like the organization's like, we have a million procedures and plans we're trying to put in place. And so this is where it rates on the list. And so at least getting started on it. And then that way too, whatever that person creates is a starting point and they can go from there.
Yeah, I think it brings us back to what you were saying earlier, to treat management as a career change, not as a reward. Because if you treat it that way as the owner, then you realize that I am asking this person to change careers. They're moving from being an individual contributor, which means that there's going to be an opening there that I need to backfill.
Right.
I'm moving them into a management position. They're backfilling somebody, or we're creating a new space for them, and they're gonna need some sort of mentor. But that helps them realize that, listen, you were delivering all of this stuff before, and now you're going to be responsible for helping the team deliver that, but you won't necessarily be delivering all of that work. Maybe you still do a portion of it, but not the whole thing. And then be able to help them transition into, what does this new role really look like? Because this has been your 9 to 5. This has been your day to day. This has been, what you've expected your weeks and your months and your quarters to look like when you were in that previous role. And now you're not going to be doing that anymore, which means you also need to maybe be backfilling the person who is going to be taking that over from you, who's also going to either need to step up or step over into the role that you were filling before, which honestly starts giving you that leadership experience from the very beginning, before you really have the onus. Like, your job before you take in the management role is to make sure that the person who's backfilling you is prepared for what to expect there, while you're also learning how it's going to change for you.
That's very true. That's very true. It's also my opinion that a lot of companies, a lot of organizations feel that, this is something we should be able to figure out on our own. And that's true. Right. If they just put their minds to it, they can solve the problem. They can make sure that they have a structure in place. They can make sure that they're building a bench and all that kind of stuff. And that's all fine. They probably do. But they also have day jobs. They already have stuff that they're doing on a regular basis. And one of the things that I think that probably, Jennie, you and I both have experienced, I know I was having a conversation with a potential client about this a month ago, and he was telling me, and it was very large organization, multinational company, and they needed help with inbound customer service calls, which is another thing that I work on. And he said, I think we need you. And he said, send me your stuff, and I'm going to send it out to the other people within my organization that are going to make the decision. And they came back and they're like, well, we should be able to figure this out. And we're going to go ahead and do that, because I think it's one of those things that companies do think that they should be able to figure these things out, and they should. But sometimes it's better to go get yourself a personal trainer to go work out, instead of just try to figure your way out around the gym if whatever you're doing is not working and you're not getting the motivation that you need. And he said, he came back to me and he said, look, I promise you what's going to happen is we're going to make a stab at it, and it's going to be half baked, and we're going to call you in 6 months because it's not going to work. So I think that this is the kind of thing that some organizations need to figure out. Who is going to be the right coach for you, the right trainer for you? There are the Jennie Loevs in the world, and there are the Richard Trains in the world, and there are a lot of people, but it's finding that fit and making sure that it's the right thing for you. And I don't know how you feel about that, Jennie, but I find that all the time. And what advice would you give to any business owner or manager who's listening to this when they're trying to figure out whether they should figure it out themselves?
I think what I would say is, first of all, that these things are much harder for people who aren't thinking about them all the time than they are for those of us who are.
Yeah.
But also making the time for something like that when they have other competing priorities
Right.
is tough and tricky. And so I would encourage them to explore bringing in, like working with a coach, bringing in somebody to support them and to learn what that might look like. Because that way they can get a chance to think, okay, what value is that? Because if you start thinking about also, in Eric Qualman, Equalman, in his book, The Focus Project, he talks about that he used to feel like, why should you buy cut up pineapple when you can cut your own pineapple? But the amount of time it takes you to cut a pineapple, like in his time, you only have like that much time with, he only has that much time with his kids, he only has that much time with these things, and so he decided like buying a cut up pineapple makes sense. And so I would say to a business owner or business leader that it's important for them to think about, yes, they can do it, but will they do it? When will they do that? And what additional support do they need around it? Because the thing is, these are the things that get pushed to the side.
Right.
And this is what makes an organization successful. And that's where I think folks think about, like, what's the direct ROI on it? The direct ROI on creating the structure and process and getting support and help is clarity, psychological safety, trust, productivity. And also, if you're looking at like the expectation is like something comes up, you have a conversation, for instance, the whole ripple effect or spiraling that can happen when something isn't discussed can be fully detrimental to multiple people and to the clients.
Absolutely. Wow. Well, we could probably go on forever on this.
I think so.
I think we've done a lot on this topic, and I really appreciate you bringing it to us, Jennie. It's been a lot of fun having this conversation. I appreciate you being here.
Thank you so much for having me back. I have loved it. It's been great. I look forward to our next conversation.
Me too. Absolutely. And Jim Bob, as always, thank you very much, my friend. And Jennie, where can somebody, if they're interested in what you have to say and your thoughts on that, or getting in touch with you, how can they do that?
They can go to my website, jloev, J-L-O-E-V, consulting.com, or they can find me on LinkedIn at Jennie Loev. Again, it's L-O-E-V. So it's dyslexic love or jumbled love. And so those would be great places for them to find me to talk further, because I do think there's such a need out there, but folks don't recognize the impact that it would make if they take that step of having someone help them and support them in that process.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Jennie and Jim Bob. And for those of you listening, thank you for joining us. Thanks for joining us for this episode of the Nice Business Podcast. We hope you got some valuable information and inspiration. We're always looking for great stories that will help your business be more kind and successful. And if you know of one we should hear, or someone that would be a great interview, please let us know. To contact me, click the link here to go to my website or use this QR code. I wish you a nice business.